Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today I wanted to talk about negative stereotypes, specifically around the fantasy science fiction genre. And this conversation is going to be brought upon by the Wired article about Brandon Sanderson. I'm sure most of you have heard about it or at least seen some video reaction to it at this point. And so I didn't want to do the same thing and go through and just kind of point out how I don't know, interesting is not the right word, but just how disingenuous or weird that article was about Brandon Sanderson. It's an interesting, I will have it linked in the description if you somehow haven't seen it. I'll probably reference it. I actually have a quote from it that I'm going to want to talk about, and it's actually what really stuck with me. So that quote is, and it's kind of towards the end of the article, is, "As is typical the case at these things," which is Dragon Steel Convention, "there's a general air, warmish, body-odored of unselfish consciousness. By my rough count, some 3/4 of the attendees are men, boys, blurring together in a mass of pale, fleshy, nerdy, in Sanderson-appropriate graphic tees." And that's the line that stuck with me the most. There's a lot in that article that, you could kind of dissect, but it really stuck with me that, this is still kind of the stereotypical thought of a lot of people when it comes to fantasy. Now, it might not seem like that, especially if you're involved in this kind of corner of Booktube where fantasy and sci-fi are like the hot thing. That's what we're talking about. It's what we all enjoy. But I think sometimes it's really easy to put our blinders on when we're a part of a community like this and just forget that, the general public, most of them don't know who Brandon Sanderson is, what Mistborn is, anything like that. They have no idea. And so I think it's important to sometimes remember that, this is still a way people think about, this whole genre of literature and, of the people who enjoy it. I do think it's interesting in a world where we have had success with certain adaptations, specifically a Game of Thrones, which I know a lot of people didn't really enjoy how it ended, but I mean, that was, on everybody's mind, or it seemed like it. It was an extremely popular show. You have the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which I think most people, loved, and obviously that's another successful fantasy adaptation. We just had House of Dragon finish up last year, and that was some of the best numbers HBO had since a Game of Thrones. And I'll even throw in The Last of Us that just recently wrapped up. That was a kind of a science fiction-y adaptation on HBO again that was extremely popular. You saw so many people loving it, and I know it didn't have like the heaviest fantasy or science fiction aspects to it. It's definitely, kind of teeters on that dystopian world, obviously, but it's still in that same vein of, something otherworldly. And to see this kind of article come out when I thought that the genre and its way it's perceived had come so far was kind of eye-opening for me, and it kind of made me reflect back on my own experiences. In my own personal experiences, and this has been some number of years now, but I can remember being in high school specifically and reading fantasy books and science fiction books and having teachers, who should probably be promoting reading, especially if you're doing reading outside of, what's assigned as curriculum. But I can remember them telling me that I'm wasting my time, that I should be reading something that's worthwhile, that is gonna like enrich my life, which is such a weird thing for a teacher to say, but also that's definitely something that can be accomplished inside of fantasy. I think if you read any number of epic fantasy stories, you have all kinds of ranges of emotion and impact, and just the way you can connect with characters who face all kinds of different problems, whether it be some kind of mythical beast that's coming and they need to overcome that, or just aspects of mental health that can be incorporated in these stories. I don't think there's one genre that is more worthwhile than another. And this article kind of spurred that back into me. I can also remember just kind of feeling judged for reading those because I was told more than once by more than one teacher that it just wasn't worth it, that I should really be dedicating that time to something that they deemed worthwhile. The Wired article also made me just think about this, as a whole, of why do people still have this kind of perception around fantasy? And I came up with a few things that I jotted down, and one of them was that they still think it's for children. And I can see that. A lot of very popular fantasy for, we're talking about the common person. We're not talking about the people who have read Malazan or Realm of the Elderlings. We're talking about people who watched, one random Lord of the Rings movie 20 years ago and then maybe read Harry Potter to their kid. To them, that's their connection to fantasy. It is. They were a child when they saw those movies. They were younger. It's something they want to show their kids. Or especially in the case of Harry Potter, they read it as a kid and then they're sharing that with their children, but they necessarily didn't go on further into the genre. They stuck there. And so when they see adults getting into it, they think of it as childish and that it's below them. And, cognitively it's not difficult, but I think any of us who have read some of these complicated series, the Wheel of Time has how many, like 1,500 named characters or something like that, and to keep count of all of the people, worlds, inner politics that are going on, to say that that's something simple and is for children, it just isn't true anymore, especially once you get away from some of the ones that are targeted for children. That, there's nothing wrong with those books, but to lump that all together is just obviously isn't accurate. But for a lot of people, that is what they think, and that's probably part of this stereotype that we still face today. Another thought I had was bad adaptations. And specifically, I was thinking of movies I enjoyed when I was a kid on like the science fiction channel, like, we all know about Sharknado, but those kind of veins, like those giant snake movies that were super popular where you had bad CGI, but snakes, like chasing after people. I don't think that kind of pulp, which definitely has its place. I still love those movies. I think they're a lot of fun, but for a lot of people, that's all they, when you think of science fiction, that's what they're thinking of. They're thinking of, what are those? Anaconda, I think, is one. Or you have like, there's sharks versus snakes. There's all kinds of those science fiction ones, which are enjoyable, but a lot of people, that's the kind of level they put it on. They don't think about, the deeper aspects of the genre. They're stuck on, early 2000s. Sharktopus, I think, is another one that was, like a combination of a shark and octopus that like went after people. But that's another thing that I thought of, that, especially people who are not involved in the space, that's where their brain goes, to those kinds of wacky, I enjoy it. I think they're fun, but to a lot of people, it probably just seems so strange and not worthwhile. I also looked online for some thoughts on this, on like, why do people look down on fantasy so much? And one thing that I thought was interesting that I saw someone bring up was the fandoms slash online, or not online conventions, but, in-person conventions that people see when they're online. I wasn't exactly sure what they meant, but, I do think that there are sometimes negative aspects highlighted in, some kinds of compilation videos, or, there's just one person who does something strange and that gets shared around to the masses, and all of a sudden everyone is associated with something weird that happened at a convention. It's an interesting thought. I don't know if that's fair, but I can see why. I can see why people think it's so strange that people dress up. I know specifically for anime it happens a lot, but they dress up in these, crazy characters. Like, imagine somebody dressing up as All Might walking around in the middle of the day. I can understand why people think that's weird, but at the same time, I think, just let people do what they want to do. I don't know why people are judging them, but I think that is maybe part of what, gets into this negative stereotype. I also tried to find some online discussions about, is fantasy, like, why do people look down on fantasy? And a lot of it that I found was actually really positive. But I think in wider spaces, just the general discussion for a lot of books and things aren't around fantasy. I think it is still very much, a smaller genre compared to, like the Danielle Steels or, those kind of people that read those kind of books. And I don't know, it was interesting. I think I've seen examples of it, not online. Online seems to be a much more fantasy open place. And I don't know if that's just a different demographic because people are slightly younger versus some of the older people. But in person, I've definitely not really ever heard anybody talking about fantasy. So maybe that has something to do with it as well. And my last thought on this was, does it matter? Does this negative stereotype really matter? And I think in general, no, it doesn't. Is it, kind of an annoying thing to have to deal with? Yes. And specifically this article, it looked like a lot of kind of strange things were happening there. I think Brandon has responded in a couple different posts on Reddit. I haven't seen them all, I haven't kept up with it that closely, but just basically saying, be respectful of the person who wrote that article. I think he also mentioned he feels, slightly betrayed by this article. And he also mentioned that, he knows something like this is always possible when he invites somebody to write an article about him. But just in general, I don't think it matters. I think you should read whatever you want to read when you want to read it and not care what other people think. I know a lot of people who think it's bad that they read smutty stuff. Who cares? Read what you want to read, enjoy it. I'm going to keep reading what I want to read and talking about it, and I think you should too. And I don't think we should let these stereotypes affect how we feel about things we enjoy. I think, this is a good learning point, and maybe all this exposure coming from this article will help people, see the genre in a better light, at least, looking for a silver lining on it. But I think everyone should just, enjoy what they want to read and don't really judge other people if they're reading something you don't like. I mean, nobody's making you read or consume something you don't want to. But definitely let me know what you think about that article down below in the comments. I'd love to hear some other people's thoughts. I know there have been a lot of good videos about it. I saw the Daniel Green one, the Murphy Napier one, the Elliot Brooks one. I think Petrick did one I haven't watched yet. A lot of really big YouTubers have talked about it, but I didn't want to dwell on that aspect of it too much, but I would love to hear anyone's thoughts about it and why they think, or why you think, fantasy has such a negative stigma around it. But that's all for me, and have a good one.